This is the third meeting in improvement project. So today we're going to be talking about dwelling approvals on resource land.
Sorry.
Today we're going to be talking about dwelling approvals on resource lands. So I'll go over a couple of housekeeping items. We'll do introductions. I'm going to provide a little bit of context for the discussion, and then we'll move right into it. And we'll wrap up in the last like 5-10 minutes with next steps going forward into the future. All right. So a couple of housekeeping things. These are hybrid meetings. So they're part in person, part online through Zoom. If you are participating through Zoom, feel free to raise your hand if you have a comment for the discussion, or drop comments into the chat, and I will do my best to make sure that those are integrated into the discussion today. If you have technical issues during this meeting, or actually at any point through the process, please call, text, or email Angela Williamson, who is providing administrative and technical support for the project. And a reminder that these meetings are being recorded and posted onto our project webpage. So if you do miss a meeting, if you aren't able to attend, those are available for review on the project website, and I would love to hear your comments and feedback on the discussion at any point in time. So feel free to watch online and to email or comment. And that goes for folks who are not part of the working group and who are following along. There are some folks who are following along and they are commenting on the process to me. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and do a quick round of introductions. I'll start in the room and then we'll go online. So if you don't know me, I am Hillary Foote, and I am the Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And here today also is Angela Williamson.
Hey, I'm Angela Winton, the admin for this group.
Again, this is the person you're going to be contacting with if you have any technical issues. And also with us today is Jim.
Hello, everyone. Jim Johnson, Oregon Department of Agriculture.
And Mike.
Mike McCarthy, McCarthy Family Farm, Parkdale, Oregon.
Nellie, give you a chance to catch your breath.
Nellie McAdams, Oregon Agricultural Trust. Sorry, it took me a minute.
All right, and then online, we have our commission liaison.
Good morning, Barbara Boyer, LCDC member, and my role today is to listen and learn and report back to the commission. And I just want to say thanks for all your great work thus far.
Thank you. And from our Citizen Advisory Committee, we have Artemio Paz.
Yes, Artemio Paz from Springfield, Oregon, a forester and an architect, and I'm here to listen and learn as well. And I'm an at-large SEAC committee member.
All right, and then from Lane County, Lori, I'm so glad you're able to join us today.
Thank you.
And
Yes, I'm Lori Siegel from Landwatch Lane County. I live in Eugene. And thank you for allowing me, I guess, to come into the work group a little bit late, since I didn't realize it was happening. Thank you.
And Blair joining us from vacation.
Buongiorno. I'm Blair Batson with 1000 Friends of Oregon. I'm a staff attorney there.
And Morrow County Planning.
Good morning. From Oregon, Tamara Mabbitt, and with me is a brand new next generation planner, Landon Jones. So he's going to listen in today because this is part of his onboarding process. Thank you very much.
Tamara, this will scare him off.
Yeah, I said there might be a few nuances, but not to worry. He's a quick study. So I agree, Jim. Thanks.
Well, welcome aboard, Landon. Look forward to talking with you in the future. And we have Gail from Clatsop.
Hi, Gail Hendrickson, Clatsop County Community Development Director.
And Matri.
I am the senior planner with Washington County.
And from Department of Forestry.
Hi, my name is Dan Hubner. I'm a GIS analyst with the Department of Forestry with a focus on land use change. And like Lori, this is my first meeting with the group. I'm returning from a leave, so sorry if I'm just getting up to speed still.
Well, we're very excited to have you back, Dan. All right, so I want to take a moment and thank you all for being here this morning and devoting so much time and effort to this process, both during these meetings and between the meetings as well. And thank you very much for your commitment to the program. So to start this meeting today, I just wanted to remind folks that the purpose of these meetings is to generate discussion about technical issues with the Goal 3 and 4 programs, the farm and forest programs. Generally, we're looking at things that contribute to lack of clarity, conflict, and result in lots of appeals. And the intent here with this process is to get those issues on the table and documented, and then to generate ideas for addressing those issues. And we don't need to necessarily solve everything today. A lot of what we'll be doing may end up in future processes, right? So our discussions and these ideas are going to be documented in a summary report that will be published in December. And will contain recommendations for future action that will be taken to the Land Conservation and Development Commission in January, where we will be requesting LCDC to provide direction for what will most likely be a multi-year work plan. So there'll be future opportunities to engage in these discussions as well. All right, so to kick off the discussion on dwellings, I am going to share just a little bit of background information on a little bit of data to sort of contextualize this. And I'm trying to share my screen. Am I co-host? Yes. Okay. Screen share real quick. So this is information that's in the Farm and Forest Report, and provides just a little bit more context about what we're going to be talking about today. So these are the number of dwelling approvals in farm zones since 1994. 1994 is the year when House Bill 3661 became effective, and that was a pretty pivotal point in the program. That's when many of the dwelling types that we see in farm and forest zones were really created. So non-farm dwellings, a lot of record dwellings, template-less dwellings. That's why you see that year 1993, throughout our statute and rules, and that's why we report on dwellings back to 94. So in farm zones, there are really two categories of dwellings get approved. There are dwellings in conjunction with farm use. So those are primary farm dwellings, essentially farm worker housing, and relative help dwellings. And on this pie chart, those dwellings in conjunction with farm use are shown in green and yellow in the upper right-hand corner. This is the on-farm workforce housing to support the agricultural economy in those areas that have been protected for agriculture. So altogether, that sort of farm worker workforce housing represents 22% of dwelling approvals on EFU since 1994. The other type of dwellings that are approved on farm zones are dwellings that are not necessarily in conjunction with a farm operation. So there are non-farm dwellings, which are shown in the reddish orange there, that represent 23% of all approvals since 1994. There are health hardship dwellings. There are a lot of record dwellings, which is a dwelling test that looks at the history of the property. And then there are replacement dwellings. which are shown in blue there. They are 36% of all approvals for dwellings in farm zones. And we're going to be starting our conversation with work placement dwellings today. So the takeaway here is what we are seeing over time is that farmer workforce housing is really only 22% of all of the dwellings that get approved. There's placement dwellings, which are a large chunk, may or may not be in conjunction with a farm operation. And it begs the question if this is in line with the original intent of the program. Over time, the proportions of dwelling approvals haven't really changed that significantly since about 2009. So if I were to show that pie chart for a series of bienniums over the past like 10-15 years, that proportion really hasn't changed that much. You'll see that in 2008, there was a decline in permit approvals for most types of dwellings, which was in line with trends in the real estate market generally at that point in time. On this historical graph, you'll see that some dwelling approval types have recovered more than others. The orange again here are non-farm dwellings. The dark blue at the very top are replacement dwellings. That blip in 2016 which is farm worker housing, is a large multi-family development that was approved on farm for a cherry orchard in 2016. And that was very unusual because we usually don't see much more than a triplex being approved as farm worker housing on farm. Then geographically, these are the number of dwelling approvals by county since 1994. Replacement dwellings, again, are dark blue. Non-farm dwellings are that sort of bright orange. And you can see that a large portion of those dwelling approvals are happening in Douglas and Deschutes and Marion counties. If you want to check out your counties, Tamra, Morrow is sort of on the lower end. Clatsop is also on the lower end of dwelling approvals. And Washington's really on the upper end of middle of the road. So we have digitized dwelling approvals since 2008. So this is an excerpt from the 2016-2017 Farm and Forest Report. It shows dwelling approvals as dots, essentially across the state of Oregon between 2008 and 2017. The red dots are simply dwellings that were approved in the 16-17 biennium. So just thinking ahead to our conversation on mapping and analysis that we're going to have at our November 2nd meeting, we do have this data set. We've looked at it before. This work was done by my predecessor, Tim Murphy, but I have not included this analysis in the two more recent Farm and Forest reports. So I think what you see here is not too surprising. You see large concentrations of development approvals in the Willamette Valley and along, sort of state highways and areas of development throughout the state. So for forest zones, there is not the same sort of opportunity for a dwelling in conjunction with a forest operation, except for a very new type of dwelling, for which we've seen no approvals yet. It's a dwelling that was established by the legislature in 2019. It's called an accessory family forest dwelling. But again, I've not seen any approvals for that dwelling type reported so far. So in forest zones, template tests are the largest class of dwelling that's approved, and replacement dwellings are the second one. And I'm sure that is not a surprise to a lot of folks here, especially Lori. Over time, template tests, you can see that same sort of decline in approvals around 2008 and a slight recovery after that. Replacement dwellings and the other types of dwellings that are permitted in forest zones, which are large lots and lot of record dwellings, health hardship dwellings, again, fairly constant over time. Lane County has the highest number of template test approvals and dwelling approvals in the county and in the state, with Clackamas coming second and Jackson third. And if you look at it visually over the state of Oregon, you'll see that's very much a west side phenomenon. You see the bulk of template test and other types of forest approvals along the 101 corridor, rimmed around the Willamette Valley, and clustered in southern Oregon. So I just wanted to provide that as a little bit of context for this discussion about dwelling types and what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so why don't we go right into it, and we're going to start talking about replacement dwellings. And I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing my screen and talk all about. Stop sharing. There we go. No, thank you. So replacement dwellings, as we've seen, are the largest category in farm zones and the second largest category in forest zones. And initially, replacement dwellings were really those dwellings that were established before the land use planning program, and oftentimes before the farm tax program. So dwellings from the 50s, the 40s, maybe even the 1800s. But now that we're 50 years into the program, we are starting to see more replacement requests for dwellings that were approved actually after the enactment of House Bill 3661. So we're seeing replacement requests for template test dwellings. We're seeing replacement requests for primary farm dwellings, for non-farm dwellings, for things that were permitted as a specific use. All right. So there is this question where we're thinking about replacement dwellings with like replacement of dwellings that existed sort of prior to permitting, and then replacement dwellings that were permitted and approved as a specific use type, right? And subject to standards and conditions of approval when they were permitted. So when we're thinking about replacement dwellings, the feedback I'm hearing from the technical working group is that there are a couple of issues. One is, as we allow replacements, which are the same standards for all dwellings, no matter how they were permitted. Now, are you replacing the structure or are you replacing the use? And the department's position has long been that you're replacing the use. Another question that comes up in looking at replacement dwellings are, how do you contextualize replacement dwellings in the preservation of workforce housing for agricultural workers, for farm operations in these areas that are protected for farming? So there are dimensional standards that a number of people have brought up, that when you have a modest farm dwelling and it is replaced with a more estate-sized dwelling, that is that a change of use? Is there a change of impact associated with that? Not only to farm and forest operations in the surrounding area, but is there an impact to the value of land in the area? All right, so there's a dimensional question related to scale. There's a question related to location of the dwelling on the property. So as we see non-farm dwellings being replaced, do they have to stay at the same location on the least suitable portion of the property for farm use? How is that considered in the review? And then that third question is around clarity of what is replacing. Is replacing like use with like use in a similar location? So to start off this discussion, I'm going to call on Mike, because I know you had a number of thoughts on it that we'd love to hear.
Okay, very good. Thank you. On replacement dwellings, what we've seen in Hood River is we own a number of parcels small farms. Hood River's often much smaller farms in some parts of the state. But what we've seen is on our own properties, no reason to have replacement dwellings. And so I'm a little skeptical of the whole idea. We have probably 20 different parcels. Every one of them's had a home on it. We remodeled those homes, put new foundations under them. So I do wonder why we need replacement dwellings in the first place. Second thing is that we've often seen that the dwelling that's replaced remains there and is rented out. And that's what we see a lot of in Hood River is rentals. And they're never removed and they're never followed up. So, you know, those are my main points on that.
Okay. So Blair, I know you also had some thoughts on replacement dwellings.
Yeah, what we hear a lot from the farmers and ranchers that we work with is what they see is similar to what Mike says, is that sort of a modest dwelling that's been there for quite some time and is associated with an individual parcel like Mike described, that may be one of many parcels that a farmer owns or rents out or rents from someone else. Someone kind of makes an offer that they can't refuse for the parcel with the old dwelling on it. And because they're not interested in farming, they're actually interested in having a house in the country. So they purchase the parcel with the modest dwelling, and then which the farmer could manage before, and they replace it with an expensive dwelling. And essentially, because of the increased value to the land, you're taking it out of the agricultural land base that is affordable by a farmer or rancher in the future. So you're sort of aiding the conversion. And you know, it's an easy process. So it seems to be quite popular now, as the numbers show. It seems to be an avenue that folks have caught on to as a way to have a house in the country, particularly in, you know, an exclusive farming zone that's designated for farming, just to live there. So in terms of your ideas about how to address this problem, I think looking at the use, having reviewed for, does this qualify as a farm dwelling, or does this qualify as a non-farm dwelling? And then limiting the size and footprint to keep that sort of goes to the land value question, that you don't want to be increasing the land value beyond the reach of farmers or ranchers in the area. So I like your suggestions.
Something to add. Yeah, I wanted to add something. I think I'm gradually waking up, but the one thing that really concerns me about replacement dwellings, Blair brought some of this up. They're often much larger, but every single replacement dwelling is, almost every single one is in a different place from the dwelling they're replacing. Usually takes an acre or so of farmland out of production by the time you get a drain field, yard, driveway, garage, et cetera, takes another acre. We do 1,000 of those in Oregon over time. We've taken 1,000 acres additional land out of production. The other thing is that it really decreases the efficiency of farming. And I think people that don't farm really don't understand this, but as soon as you put a house in the middle of a field, you really change the total efficiency of farming that parcel. If you add up the costs, you have more turns. Every time you have a turn with a tractor, you're compacting the soil more, you're reducing the efficiency of your operation. And if you have really small fields, the turn time can be 50% of the actual operating time. And that gets to be an extremely inefficient parcel of the farm. And in many cases, these small fields, you can't really efficiently farm them at all. So it really is a very difficult situation. And we lease a number of parcels where people have put houses in the wrong place. And it's a very difficult situation. And they want us to notify them at 4 in the morning if we're going to spray, or put it this way, they want us to notify them if we're going to spray, but they don't want us to notify them if it's 4 in the morning. So what do you do?
Hillary, I don't know how to raise my hand. This is Lori. So I butting in. I can't find my hand on my Zoom screen. I wanted to, I agree obviously with everything that all the issues that people are having. We have all these issues. with replacement dwellings. But I think, as Mike just pointed out, the biggest issue is most of them are in Lane County referred to as non-same site replacements. So that means they get to put them in a new site regardless of what they were approved as. And it allows the conversion of the existing dwelling to what's characterized as a non-residential use. But they're all converted to guest houses. And if a guest house isn't a residential use, the only other thing it could possibly be would be a commercial use. I can't wrap my head around any other explanation what a non-residential use is, other than if you were going to convert, to some kind of storage, a barn or a shed or something like that. But that's not what happens here. And all that's required is to remove the kitchen facilities, so you can replace those with microwaves and toaster ovens. And that's considered non-residential. And so we end up with 2 dwellings, as Mike pointed out, not 1. And it is definitely for purposes of making money. It's more of a commercial use, really. And I just, it's a huge problem here. Even though we're not a farm county, we're a forest land county, it's still a major problem.
And you're seeing those used as short-term rentals, Lori?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And Jennifer, I know you had a number of thoughts about this question as well. And Jennifer Hughes, Clackamas County.
Thanks. Yeah, just a few comments. I, first of all, completely agree on this question about enforcing against the old dwellings that are replaced. I mean, we struggle with that. We don't have the staff. I'm sure, as you know, Clackamas County has lots and lots and lots of replacement dwellings. And I would suspect, many of them are leaving the other one up, and maybe it's quote unquote being converted, but I think, as others have said, that it's not really clear what that means to convert. It's not really clear what's required under the building code to convert it. It can basically be habitable space. They pull out the stove. It takes 15 minutes to turn it back into a house. So I think some clarity on that would be helpful, because we're just never going to have the staff to do enforcement of those conversions. It would probably be easier if we just said they had to be demoed, but then that doesn't seem particularly sustainable. So, there's arguments on both sides. We have struggled, and it sounds like maybe DLCD has a position on this. Our attorney looked for case law and couldn't find me anything, but it's this question about really what does it mean for the dwelling that's being replaced to have been lawfully established? Was that at the point in time, or it's the ongoing compliance with whatever the conditions are? I think clarity is needed, but I would sort of caution on how far we go with that, because I know dwellings that were approved in Clackamas County before 3661, good luck even figuring out what the conditions were. The standards were not robust. Somebody might have said they were going to have literally like an emu farm. Are we really saying they have to have that till the end of time? I don't know if that really helps anybody. So I do think we need to think, for those older ones especially, about what it means to be lawfully established. And then even on the newer farm dwellings, the income ones, I mean, I know there's the standard that says it has to be occupied by the person who, made the money, but I think we all understand that that can't be for eternity. So does that mean they have to maybe prove income again to do the replacement? What would the standard be for that? And then finally, and I'm sorry, I was about 15 minutes late, so if this was in your presentation, I apologize. I looked at the replacement dwelling bill, and it seems like they actually pulled the EFU replacement dwelling siting standards out, and those are repealed, which is sort of the opposite of where I think this group thinks we should go. So that's sort of interesting to think about doing rulemaking that would kind of, go against what seems to have been a pretty specific change in the statute. So just a comment more than anything else. Great, thank you. And I think this is a really important question that needs
and love to hear from other people on this topic before we go to Tamara, and that is, you know, the continuation of the use over time, particularly for those dwellings that were established with restricted occupancy. So dwellings that were established essentially accessory to a primary farm operation, whether it's a primary farm dwelling, which includes large lot dwellings, or farm worker housing, or relative help dwelling. As we have heard, you know, that it is an enforcement issue over time. It's very difficult to enforce. Would love to hear thoughts about that. I'm sure you.
Sure. I've had a lot of experience with replacement dwellings, going back to my days as a county planner. And I think we have to combine what we're talking about with replacement dwellings with the whole idea of what is a non-conforming use and what is not. Sometimes we forget about the non-conforming use section of the statute. And really, in my remembering what's been going on in my career back and forth on replacement dwellings, the primary reason replacement dwellings are there are to deal with non-conforming uses and to deal with disaster situations, fire and things like that. It's not supposed to be there to allow a 2,000 square foot house to be replaced with a 8,000 square foot house that has no nexus to being approved as a non-farm dwelling or a farm dwelling, or in the forest zone going through one of the dwelling tests. It's supposed to be to replace something generally at the same site where the original dwelling was at. And if you replace it at the same site, then you're not going to have that enforcement issue, because the other one's going to have to be removed or expanded on, as opposed to having two on the same site there situation. When you replace at the same site, a lot of the compatibility standards aren't there with surrounding resource uses, because the farmer or the forester has been dealing with that same house already. You move it, and you know, at a minimum, if you move it, you should have to go through some siting process to make sure that it's compatible with surrounding farm and forest uses, not just say it's a new replacement dwelling. And I'm not sure I support that anyways. You know, I really do think that if it's not at the same site, there needs to be some kind of siting standards. And if it's replacing a dwelling that was approved as a farm dwelling or a non-farm dwelling, it should have to go through that process again. If it's a non-conforming use, in other words, it predates a farm dwelling or a non-farm dwelling or a forest-related dwelling or whatever, then there should be some kind of standard that makes sure that it still remains in terms of the same impact. So a percentage increase versus, you know, if you go past a certain percentage increase, then you have to get a new approval. You have to go through a new process, a non-farm dwelling, the non-forest dwelling, or whatever. You know, it really comes back, in my opinion, to what really was the purpose of a replacement dwelling in the first place. Not to create another opportunity for another non-farm use, to expand the use as going from a traditional modest house to a McMansion on farmland. There's a lot of them out there. I can show you pictures of them where it's basically a hunting cabin for somebody from the East Coast to come out here and hunt in Wallowa County or something. When it was a 1,000 square foot cabin, now it's a 10,000 square foot motel, basically. There's a lot of those out there. And so I really think we've got to get back to what was the original purpose of a replacement dwelling. Not just to establish a dwelling, but to recognize a non-conforming use. And I do remember the discussions we had in Washington County with Dave Van Ash, and you know, you've got the old farmhouse sitting on the property that's been there since 1850, and it's sitting on a foundation that's about ready to fall in. The whole discussion on that was to protect the right to replace that dwelling, but place it on the site where it was at, and not to have any greater impact, but to still maintain that ability to have that other dwelling, even though you may already, you know, it might be 2 or 3 houses on it. And that gets to Mike's idea about, or comment about, farmers owning multiple parcels, and a lot of them have dwellings on it, like so.
And I think it was Gail, I think you had some questions about, are there circumstances when we might not want to replace a dwelling in its original site?
Were those my questions?
Was that your question?
I don't know. Maybe I was more astute than I thought, but I know here sometimes we, for example, are dealing with a restoration and alteration of an existing dwelling, which is partially in the floodway. And so that could be an example of when you might want to encourage somebody to actually think about relocating a building or a replacement structure. Same thing with the geologic hazards. But for the most part, the things that we're seeing, we see a lot more, I think, restoration and alteration than replacement, or maybe equal parts. So.
All right, thank you. And Tamara, you've been patiently waiting.
Oh, thank you. You bet. Excellent comments. I appreciate it very much. I just want to, I support and have learned a lot from the comments happened already today. From my perspective in Morrow County, and I also spent 20 years in Umatilla County, I don't see this, it's different out here. Not surprising, you hear that from us a lot. When the law, I don't remember what year, was passed to clarify and allow the second part of replacement dwellings. So previously it was really clear that there had to physically be a dwelling there. And then the law that it's been, I don't know, 5 sessions or so back, that allowed counties to replace a dwelling where there's proof that one was previously there. That I think was very positive in the rural Eastern Oregon perspective. I think it also, I don't remember all the names and all the specifics, but there were a lot of landowners who said, gosh, there was this cabin here, or gosh, there was a house here. Why couldn't we replace it? And I think our ability to do that made the program more popular. I mean, statewide, the program out here isn't as popular as it might be on the west side. And being a local planner, several of you do now, and several of you have previously, that's a much better position for us to be in. We also do not see this proliferation of replacement dwellings for secondary income. I don't know of any, and we also don't have the enforcement problem. The majority of the replacement dwellings are on the same site, and that's just a hunch. I'd have to pull through all of our reports to tell you that. So just want to share the Eastern Oregon perspective. It looks a little differently here. We don't, I don't know, we might have a handful of McMansions. The vast part of Eastern Oregon, that's not an issue. Might be with our neighbors in Wallowa County to the east. Anyway, just a plea that the issues look different here, and possibly we should consider something other than one size fits all. And to keep it as simple. Right now, it's simple, straightforward affidavit for replacement dwelling, etc. Thank you. Happy to answer questions.
I'm curious if other counties had issues with enforcement and replacement dwellings, either for in maintaining that, a second dwelling on the property or otherwise.
Yeah, Clatsop County really hasn't had an enforcement issue. Again, it's probably 50-50 between the replacement and the restorations and the alterations. But we have never run into an issue where people have kept the original house and turned it into a short-term rental or anything like that we're aware of. So.
Maitri?
So yeah, with us, we do see a lot of the replacements at a different location, but we also have this condition during our approval where prior to final occupancy of the new home, we require them to have completed either the demo or the removal or, just kind of decommission the home into whatever structure they're proposing. So a lot of the times it's storage, and we have our inspectors go out and take a look, or if they're proposing an office, then we do let them retain some of the features, but that also kind of stays somewhat of a gray area. So some clarification there as to how much we can let them retain or not. That's kind of a judgment call we make. But one of the issues that was raised, like we do allow wet bars, but then one of the issues that was raised was, it's not hard to establish a kitchen at this time. Earlier, we required that 220 volt to be removed, but now that's not even relevant anymore. People can have a fully functional kitchen without a 220. So it would be good if that were addressed or kind of updated to the facilities available to people today.
And just for folks online who are following the conversation, oftentimes if you don't have a kitchen facility, then it doesn't fall into the dwelling category and it can be considered like an accessory guest house that's accessory to the residential use on the property. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about, taking out the kitchen.
We also have a lot of people asking about guest houses, but we tell them no. At the most, we'd allow maybe an entertainment room or an office or something of that sort, but even that would be for personal use. We've had people try to convert it into a proper conference room and all that, clearly for the occupancy of more than one person, and we've told them they can't have that.
Okay, thank you. That is interesting. So I'm hearing that there's some concern around clarifying that language around replacements, the sort of removal, demolition or conversion aspect of it. And that is actually something that we do track through the farm and forest reporting. There's so I'll circulate some statistics on that for the state after this meeting as well, because I think it would be interesting to see since we've been collecting that data, like how that distributes, because it sounds like there's different issues across the state with that. But that is something that I don't think we've previously seen in the comments before necessarily so much.
Hillary?
Oh, Mike, did you have a question?
Well, I have a comment.
Yeah.
I really think that if the dwelling that was there, the existing dwelling was bad enough that you have to replace it, that it should be totally removed. And I think if they're not totally removed, you're going to end up with problems down the road that if you really actually are serious about enforcement, it's going to cost the county money to try to enforce them. So that's my thoughts on that. And I was thinking just for the group, in Hood River County may be a little different than some counties, but there's many counties throughout the state that have this similar thing. But in terms of needing more dwellings in the farm zone, which I don't think we do, I just thought, so from my home farm, within 1 mile of my home farm, there's 3 unoccupied farm dwellings that are empty that are good dwellings. There's 4 second homes. There's probably 5 that are rented out to non-farmers, and these are principal farm dwellings. And then there's a number of illegal ADUs and STRs. I do not know how many exactly. That's within 1 mile of our home farm. And I don't think that's unique to Hood River County. There's maybe some counties that don't have that problem much, but most counties do.
Hillary, this is Lori. For some reason, I don't have a hand to raise. So I apologize.
Oh, thank you.
I've looked everywhere. I agree with Mike about the demolition. I mean, on the one hand, the state has a housing, the state asserts that we have a housing crisis and there's not enough homes. On the other hand, we're allowing the demolition in the EFU zone of homes that aren't dilapidated. They're not public health nuisances. And at the same time, we're approving temporary medical hardship and relative farm help dwellings. Relative farm help dwellings are not temporary, they get to be there forever. And so maybe it's because we don't have an inventory of existing dwellings. I don't really know what the solution is, but I totally agree with Mike that we shouldn't be demolishing homes that aren't dilapidated or a public health nuisance, destroyed by fire or flood, for example. Right. Thank you.
So in both of these comments, I'm hearing, a little bit of this echo of like, so there's a stock of workforce housing, right, to support agricultural operations. And, on the one hand, I think I've heard you say, Mike, that there's, at least in certain areas, an adequate supply of those type of dwellings to house workforce as long as they're maintained for farm workers and not converted to non-farm use. Am I capturing that?
Yeah, correctly. We have quite a bit of farm worker housing, but there is one situation that is not really that good. Some farmers over the last 20, 30 years have gotten tax credit from the state to build farm worker housing. Well, we see in some cases in our county where new owners are coming in, buying those properties and renting those farm worker housing units out to skiers. And it's a totally inappropriate use, and they got a tax credit. Actually, they didn't, the previous owner did, and so that's not tracked in any way, but it's being converted away from farm worker housing.
And that was probably approved as farm worker housing, but now it's not being used as well.
Yes.
So it's an enforcement issue too. So, okay.
Tamara.
Yeah, thank you. I told you I have a quick study here. Landon and I were just chatting. It's a really important tool for estate planning. So we have some large ranches. So you've pointed this out before, Jim and Hillary. Large ranches and farms are thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. And it's not unusual to want to have 2 dwellings. They fully qualify under, even as a principal planner. They might not want to partition the property, but they might want to deed or trust over a dwelling to a family member. And for tax purposes and for regulatory purposes, it really keeps things simple to have the replacement dwelling as a tool. So just one more voice saying, it looks different out here and it's been helpful. Thank you.
Right that. All right.
Jackie has a hand up. It's just hard to see with the green.
Oh,
Yeah,
Jackie, I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I had a couple thoughts where on the road where I live, there's at least 3 houses that are not livable on farmland, and the farmers, I mean, we don't want to be landlords and we don't want to there's a lot of other expenses and culture in some of these houses that are not being lived in. And I feel like I just wanted to bring that up. So either it's a part of their family or succession or estate planning that house is just going to be there uninhabited, or it's a financial burden, or it's the other rules and regulations in having a rental on farmland. And it's also protecting your farmland to not have, the other outside traffic or conflicts. So I wanted to bring that up because I feel like, at least in Washington County, there's quite a few not lived in properties on farms. And Mike bringing up the replacement dwellings and things, it's also quite common here where people would leave a wall or a part of a house and then build on the mansion, but they don't stop there. Then they bring in loads and loads and loads of dirt, or they completely change not just the house, but then they're changing, they add dirt so they could get out of a wetland. They're trying to, I feel like I've said this before, sometimes it goes all to money decisions. So I'm going to bring in these loads of dirt and hopefully the county won't catch me. So then the value of my place goes up for whatever reasons, whether it's flooding or just attractiveness or access to the house, etc. So I wanted to bring up that level also, that it's not just the actual building. It's adding the shop, it's adding the garage, it's adding the boat driveway, the fifth wheel driveway, the, motorhome that stays for the summer. So just a couple of thoughts I had. Thank you.
So what I'm hearing is that there are also often sort of terrain or landscaping issues that go along with some of these replacement dwellings, replacement of farm dwellings into sort of estate dwellings, particularly in Washington County. We're going to talk about build permits at our last meeting.
Good, because it's a big issue.
Yeah.
Especially in Washington and Multnomah counties with all the stuff going on in the industrial zones in Hillsborough, and that they got to get rid of that soil someplace.
Yeah.
Hillary, I just had one comment question related to Jackie's first point and Tamara's point 2 points before.
Yeah.
Because I'd understood, 5 years ago, whenever replacement dwelling standards were changed, that the dwelling itself didn't need to be there. That was because of wildfire damage, and if the dwelling had been destroyed through wildfire or another incident, like you still wanted to have that equitable result where people could replace their home. And then, I'm hearing Jackie say that there are a lot of homes that they don't really need that are kind of littering the agricultural landscape. But then I'm worried, what if someone whose sole interest in the first place was to have a large residence, how far back can they track to see that a home used to be on this area? I mean, are we looking at pioneer homes and sort of providing that? Because that doesn't seem to be in line with the purpose of what I understood that changed rule being, where you didn't have to have the home standing. You could just point to the prior existence of a home. That opens a huge door in my mind.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to do some research on that, because the reason I remember this came up in Washington County, and I hate to use names, but Dave Van Ash was big behind this. He farms multiple parcels, 4,000 or 5,000 acres, and he only owns half of that, if not that. And his issue always was not that there had been a house there, but that there is a house there that's dilapidated. And because they haven't had power to it, and there isn't a working water system or whatever, it wasn't considered available for replacement. And that was what the new standards for non-conforming use for replacement dwellings were about, where if there's a structure still there, no matter in what form or whatever, then you could replace that even if it didn't meet the definition of dwelling, because it didn't have the power and it didn't have the like. It wasn't that you could just say there was a dwelling there 50 years ago and now we can get a new one. That's the way I understand what the purpose of all that was. We're going to need to track that down, because I've never supported nor seen any real things that, gee, there was a house here 100 years ago, so I can still stick a house there. That's just not how it's supposed to work.
So this is Lori. The current replacement language in the statutory language in the EFU zones has part of it has a sunset January 2024. And the replacement dwellings in the EFU zone were supposed to have them prior to, I guess, 2021, had a 5-year look back. And so you didn't have to have a dwelling if you had paid taxes for the last, ad valorem was the language, ad valorem taxes for the previous 5 years for a replacement dwelling that no longer existed. And Landwatch was involved in this, I guess you're supposed to call it some kind of negotiations with the legislature because of our win in the Supreme Court and the lobbyists' attempt to overturn our win for replacement dwellings in the EFU zone. And so the so-called compromise was this 1973 look back. And I think that might be what Jim's talking about.
Yeah.
And so that was put there as a supposed negotiating chip. And it's ridiculous. You didn't have to have, I don't know what kind of evidence you were supposed to come up with. In Lane County, we've only seen a few try to use that 1973 look back, and they've been successful. But it's supposed to, again, it's supposed to sunset January 2024. But just to let people know, this session, Honeycutt tried to remove that sunset in another bill, and we only accidentally found out about it. And so this is a problem when something's put in as that is supposedly some kind of compromise, but then it's supposed to sunset. And this was a huge loophole, right? To a 1973 look back versus a 5-year look back from the time that you applied for the replacement. And so the fact that it's supposed to go away is very important. And the lobbyist, this session, like I just said, if we hadn't been paying attention, and we're not a lobbying organization, we were only paying attention for a particular reason, but if we hadn't been, Honeycutt probably would have gotten away with removing that sunset because no one seemed to understand why it was there. But just for everybody's information here, that 73 look back supposed to go away. January 2024.
It is. So House 2023 House Bill 2192 will become effective on January 1st this year. And that does change the provisions for replacement dwellings in farm zones. So it has that sort of assessed as a dwelling for 5 years. And an application has to be filed within 3 years of the date that the dwelling last possessed all of the features that qualify it as a dwelling for replacement. So there are some changes coming down the pike. Those provisions will now be applied to forest zones as well as farm zones. So after January 1st, the standards for forest zones and farm zones are going to be the same. So there'll be a loosening of the standards in forest zones and a little bit of a tightening of the standards in the farm zones where that look back to 73 is gone, and there's that new provision and will be in the statutes that requires a dwelling to be replaced within 3 years of the date that it last had the qualifying features. So that's on the horizon.
Can you explain the 73 look back? What does that mean?
So those are no longer going to be effective, but I think those were
1973 was when the planning program started, so that's what the look
But
back.
the look back, you've had to, during some time between now and 1973, you had a dwelling there that was a real dwelling, is that what?
right. And so those are no longer there. They were there for what, about 3 years, 4 years? I think it was 2019 to.
Yeah, it's been about 3 years. 21. I think it was 2021.
And then it went to 5 years.
So now those are gone. And so as long as the dwelling was assessed as a dwelling for 5 years, right, then and as long as that application is made within 3 years of the dwelling having had those features. So I can circulate a copy of the provisions of 2192 that are going to become effective.
And that the really key part to there is that it was assessed for 5 years as a dwelling, because you can't have it both ways. A lot of people would go into a county assessor and say, this isn't a house anymore, nobody's living here, it doesn't have this, so don't assess it for its value because they didn't want to pay tax on it. Then they turn around and say they want to replace it. With this provision that it had to be assessed for at least 5 years, that's going to get rid of a lot of that.
Okay. So
I have one more.
and then we need to move on to non-farm dwellings. So I know that's going to be a fun conversation, but go ahead, Jackie.
Okay, I'm not sure how to package this, but another observation in Washington County is the number of Measure 37 claims. And what that sometimes looks like is a replacement dwelling for the original farmhouse or something like that, and then the additional dwellings being added, most often in the very smack dab middle of a field. So some of these places are farmer owned, some of them not, but regardless, I feel like that's just still another layer. I don't know how much activity there is for these filings right now, or what the how rapidly or the continuation of these filings are going to be, but it's just another variable that we see here, especially along like the highways, like Highway 47. Yeah, most the more heavily trafficked areas, these claims are being utilized, and with the increased dwellings in the ag infrastructure.
So we do track when dwellings are built using Measure 37 and 49 rights. We have a Measure 49 specialist who's responsible for doing that and reviewing those. We actually have a website where they're mapped, all of the claims across the state, and we've published that information in the Farm and Forest report as well. There was a question from the work group about when a Measure 49 claim is transferred, it starts a clock, a 10-year clock rolling, and that dwelling needs to be built within that 10-year time frame. And there has been a question as to, when do you have to have your Measure 49 building established by? I'm forgetting the word. I think it's established. I did talk to our Measure 49 expert about that. We have an opinion on that, but there's no case law on it, and so that's something that we are interested in looking at in rulemaking. I think it was Main Street that had that question as well. So I'll provide an update.
Yes, and one of the issues we faced in the last few years is for people who've applied within that 10-year clock. Because of the pandemic situation, a lot of them went into the expiration, and that kind of became a moot. And we've always been applying it as the dwelling has to have final occupancy, just to be more restrictive, because there's more clarity needed there, which is why which is one of the reasons I brought that question up.
So we are looking at that, and we'll consider that. All right, so we definitely want to sort of move on to non-farm dwellings and the conversation around that. So non-farm dwellings were not on the original 1960 list of uses. They were established as a use in 1973 with the passage of Senate Bill 101. And at that point in time, Hector McPherson stated the purpose of that provision was, quote, not to open exclusive farm use zones to subdivisions, but rather to provide a little escape valve whereby we can allow a small amount of single family residentials within the exclusive farm use zone. So as we've seen, about 23% of all farm dwellings approved in the state have been non-farm dwellings, which seems to exceed that sort of little escape valve descriptor. And in Cherry Lane versus Jackson, which we have referenced in the Farm and Forest report, the courts sort of came out with this great statement that, I'll quote this: an EFU zone is designed to preserve the limited amount of agricultural land to the maximum extent possible. It contains a substantial limitation on other uses of rural land. In order to achieve this purpose, the legislature imposed substantial restrictions on the construction of non-farm dwellings in the EFU zone. The clear intent is that non-farm dwellings be the exception, and that approval for them be difficult to obtain. The current standards for review of non-farm dwellings are quite involved. They're complicated. And yet we are still seeing a number of non-farm dwellings being approved, as evidence in the data that we looked at earlier. I was going to run through it, but in the interest of time, I'll just be really brief. The first screen, and there are different standards for non-farm dwellings in the Willamette Valley and outside of the Willamette Valley. Outside of the Willamette Valley, like just really quickly, there's a screen based on soils. If it's under forest assessment, there's another screen based on capability, vegetative capability. And for determining if a parcel is presumed suitable for farm use. So you have to identify then that parcel or portion of a parcel is not suitable based on a number of factors associated with that. So if you determine that there's a portion of farm property that's not suitable, then you move on into a compatibility test, similar to the farm and forest, similar to the farm impacts test. And then if you find that to be the case, then you moved on to what's called a material stability test. And this is a really complex exercise where you look at 1,000 to 2,000 acre area of resource zoned land. So things that are zoned for farm forest, mixed farm forest. You provide your reasoning for choosing that study area sort of based on soils, farm practices, etc. You move into an analysis of the development trends within that study area. So as a planner, you most likely are going to need to pull all of the property files and determine how existing dwellings were approved. If they were approved as non-farm dwellings, out of record dwellings, if they were pre-land use dwellings, etc. And you assess sort of the development trends from 1993 until the present. And then you assess the potential future development within your study area by looking at soils and parcel sizes and making a determination over that 2,000 acre area, what parcels and tracts could host a lot of record dwellings, other non-farm dwellings, etc. And then you look at potential land divisions and then for that large study area. And then based on all of that analysis, based on the characterization of the agriculture area, existing dwelling and dwelling development trends, and that analysis of future potential dwelling development, you make a determination if that will all cumulatively impact the stability of the agricultural economy in that area. It's quite an involved test. So that's a bit of that background.
Hillary, can you just say a bit about, like, I wish all that applied in Lane County, but because Lane and Washington are marginal lands counties, even though we're in Lane's in the valley, we don't have any of those approval criteria for non-farm dwellings. And it's confusing because marginal land counties were supposed to, quote, give up something to retain marginal land county status, but I don't know what that is. I can't see anything that was given up except lot of record, but then you could have a lot of record dwellings, I guess. But yeah, none of that approval criteria applies.
Mm-hmm. So again, there are 2 counties in the state that are marginal land counties. So Lane County and Washington County, and they have different standards for non-farm to use. Because we have such limited time today, I think we can visit that question offline, Lori. I think that would be interesting, maybe with Matri as well. But let's just move into some of the ideas from this group about sort of addressing non-farm development in general. So I've heard a couple of things. So one of the ideas, Claire, do you just want to talk a little bit about Rutherford and the background on that?
Yeah, but first I want to say, I mean, I think it's interesting seeing what your numbers don't show were all the existing dwellings in the EFU zones across the state before the planning program even started, much less in 1994 when House Bill 3661. There were already a lot of dwellings. Mm-hmm. And of course, you know, they're concentrated in certain areas. You know, there's certain Eastern Oregon states that have very few dwellings, but wherever there's development pressure, there's a lot of dwellings, and a lot of them are non-farm dwellings, even if they were approved as farm dwellings, replacement dwellings, temporary hardship dwellings. People who are not farming are living in them. So we're having a lot of conversion. There's thousands and thousands of dwellings in EFU zone. So I actually think in the long run, we could talk about these standards, but just you reading them exhausted me. I mean, it's so difficult for an applicant, for a county planning staff, for any neighbors who want to challenge it to go through those tests. It's like, are you kidding me? I mean, they're just tough. And then of course there's litigation. So they're kind of a nightmare the way they are now. And I think the truth of the matter is there's really no policy reason anymore. Hector wanted to give a political break or ease. He didn't want to put too much pressure on the EFU zone. It's always an issue. We'll always be facing with it. But they didn't have the population pressures, the numbers of people who wanted to just live in Oregon, much less live in the rural zones, the people coming in who don't know anything about zoning. And, you know, so there's an ongoing political pressure. But from a purist planning view, if you're planning a zone where the policy direction from the state legislature is protect the maximum amount of agricultural land forever, and there's zones where you're supposed to have commercial farming, they're not residential zones, you wouldn't have non-farm dwellings. I mean, and there's really no more policy reason to even have non-farm dwellings, period. We shouldn't have them. But the political pressure is still there. I know LCDC isn't going to get rid of non-farm dwellings, and I know the legislature isn't. But I do think being much clearer in the criteria is helpful. So I can talk about Rutherford, but I really think the bigger issue is getting clearer standards. And I actually think the only way to do that is we can't do it with just a rule. I think that long-term, we need the state to work with. I mean, it's crazy that DLCD does not really have a robust, if any, GIS mapping capability, but to work with the other state agencies, you have all the criteria. And we've seen this done. Metro has it. They've done it in the 3 metro counties to map all the existing parcels, non-farm dwellings, farm dwellings, non-farm uses that are out there. So anytime a county is looking at an application for a non-farm dwelling or any other non-farm use, they can do this calculation. They don't have to, they can go, oh my gosh, you know, if we keep approving these, we're going to convert, you know, this area, this valuable area of Washington County to non-farm uses. It's really hard to do on a case-by-case basis. So I think we can fiddle with it. We can talk about it, but I really think I think we really need to work together to get resources that benefits everybody involved in the program, the applicants, people who are seeking for uses, people, county planners, and people who are concerned about too much development. But with that said, you asked me, so Rutherford basically was a test, a Court of Appeals case that was won in 1977. And it said that when you're considering one factor of the non-farm dwelling test, which, and the basic criteria is the land generally unsuitable for the production of crops or livestock? You can't, if you're dealing with a small parcel or an unproductive parcel, you don't just consider that parcel in isolation as a commercial unit. As Mike has talked about and Jim has talked about, throughout Oregon, it's not just the Willamette Valley, farmers and ranchers aggregate lots of parcels into, you know, owned and leased into a farm or ranch. So you consider whether that parcel can be managed as part of another farm operation. And in this Luba case, they didn't mention Rutherford. It was a case that was brought and lost by Central Oregon Land Watch. There was a de facto reversal of it. And it said in this certain situation, because they based the unsuitability on something other than size, then they didn't have to consider whether the parcel could be farmed in conjunction. So I think it was a confusion, and I just think it's a simple. I don't think it's highly controversial. I'm not even sure that the county expected that outcome. I don't think they advocated for that. I think it was a confusing outcome. So just correcting it is to restore that understanding that if you're considering the suitability of a piece of ag land for productive agricultural use, you ask whether it can be farmed or managed in conjunction with other properties.
So I want to bring up one of the things that you touched on earlier, Blair, which is you know, providing support to counties to complete these really onerous reviews. And with additional support and clarity, I think there still hangs the question of, you know, how does a county determine when you've reached that tipping point? When have you got that last straw that breaks the camel's back and disrupts the stability of the agricultural economy? Matri or Jennifer, do you have thoughts on that? And how do you, well, I'm sorry, Jennifer, how do you come to that conclusion?
Sorry, I had somebody in my office asking a question. So I know we're talking about non-forest or non-farm uses, but I don't know exactly what you're asking me.
So I think the question is, like, how does a county come to the conclusion that you've reached a tipping point where the material stability of the agricultural economy will be altered by approval of a non-farm dwelling?
Have absolutely no idea. And to be honest, we get very, very few of these.
Yeah.
I think we've had 2 in the last 5 years, and it's honestly, it's like reinventing the wheel every time. And they were both in completely different locations. Our soil's too good here. So the reality is we just get very, very few of these, and we've built very little institutional capacity to even know how to do it. But I can tell you it took an incredible amount of staff time and cost way, way, way more than what we charged for the application fee. So any sort of technical assistance that could be provided would be appreciated, because eventually we will get one more of these. But yeah, it's just not a huge issue for us.
It's interesting too, Jennifer, the original case, this is old, this is back when I was at DLCD, that talked about the overall stability of the land use pattern criterion came out of Clackamas County, Sweet 10 versus Clackamas County, I think. And so it would be interesting to go back and look at that. Cumulative impacts is what we're really talking about here. And it is a difficult standard, but it's an important one because it's becoming the conversion issue way more than urban growth, way more than anything else. And that's the cumulative impacts of non-farm development on farmland and on forest land. And so it's something that we should try as a group to try to better define and flesh out. You know, I'll wait for my turn for my other comments, but you know, it's interesting that the original case did come out of Clackamas County. Of course, that was prior to you know, the division of the Willamette Valley versus the rest of the state in terms of how non-farm dwellings are approved. So,
right, it's not really an issue. It's just not the big issue in the Willamette Valley. We see the numbers in Central Oregon, Douglas County. You know, said that I think because LCDC changed the law in 1994.
and this one I might just.
For what it's worth, Oregon Ag Trust is part of our Farmer Merit Protection Plan, does a contagion analysis, and so we have set up a customized analysis for ranking parcels based on nearby fragmentation. So it doesn't include all of the things that you would include in cumulative impacts. As Blair said, that data just needs to be connected and inputted, but that's something that I don't know how to do, but my staff could help think about how modeling could look for that.
Awesome, that's really interesting. Excited for our last meeting. Did you want to go?
Sure. Over the years, I've had a lot of, I probably get as many questions about non-farm dwellings as I do anything. And there's a whole lot of different issues here, but I'd like to start out with one that Catherine Daniels and I used to talk about an awful lot. And that is the fact, whether or not something should be approved or not, and I'll get to that in a second. Let's just say for the sake of discussion that there is going to be an approval. It's an appropriate non-farm dwelling. There's no siting standards for non-farm dwellings in the exclusive farm use zone. And so you really, you're surrounded by orchards, or you've got orchards on two sides, and they want to site the dwelling next to the orchard as opposed to over on the other side of the parcel away from there. There's nothing that really requires that. And so I think we really need to look at also siting standards for non-farm and non-forest dwellings such that they're sited not to impact farming and forest operations if they're appropriate to be approved. So that's one item. Catherine and I used to just, why don't we do this kind of thing? That's just great, resource land protection. Willamette Valley standards versus the rest of the state. this is a big issue more and more for all kinds of issues, not just dwellings, but other uses on high value farmland. And that is, do we need to expand this similar type restrictions to other parts of the state? There are some pretty high value agricultural areas that are not in the Willamette Valley. Jefferson County, for example, in the North Unit Irrigation District. You know, Morrow County is becoming more and more an issue with, you know, with the cumulative impact of non-farm development and its impacts within the groundwater management area, for example. So are there, Malheur County, high value irrigated agricultural land, Hood River County, I mean, this is some of the most intensive agriculture in the entire state. And yet you don't have this, you know, the standard is pretty wide open for non-farm dwellings. So one of the things I think we need to consider is, do we expand the standards that we use in the Willamette Valley for non-farm dwellings to other parts of the state? And I'll bring that issue up again when we talk about other non-farm uses also on high value farmland. It's just something, Tamara's heard me talk about this before. The dairy operators in Morrow and Umatilla counties over there or whatever are just so upset that they're not considered the same as high value farmland when they're generating income on a per acre basis greater than what some of the places in the Willamette Valley are creating. So we need to look at what should be considered high value farmland on a basis more than just soils. And that's a bigger issue. Land divisions. We're going to talk about land divisions, but when you create non-farm land divisions, you're just creating opportunities for non-farm dwellings. And you know, to preclude non-farm land divisions is going to get at a big part of the problem, especially outside the Willamette Valley. You know, I used to talk to Hector McPherson about this all the time, and his point about non-farm dwellings, where it's kind of like, if there is no viability for a subject parcel, then let's look at a non-farm dwelling. It's that safety valve. It's like a super variance. It's not supposed to be there to allow to continue to be creating more opportunities by dividing off non-farm parcels and making things less viable and the like. They're supposed to be really based on existing parcels, because if you've got a 100-acre parcel and it happens to have a 5-acre corner of it that's really terrible soil, all farms have terrible parts on them. You know, woodlots or marginal land or wasteland or the like. But to allow that to be divided off, then yes, that 5 acres is no longer viable in the sense that it's totally rock. But if it was part of the larger parcel, that's part of a farm. Farms and ranches have, you know, parts of their property that are not non-viable for growing something. It doesn't mean they're not viable for something else. Winter grazing, putting your storage buildings on that part of the parcel, that type of thing. So we need to really look at how land divisions are being manipulated to create more opportunities for non-farm dwellings and non-forest dwellings. I talked about siting standards, but you know, one of the things, and I'd be interested in what Tamara thinks about this, one of the things that I've had a problem with as a planner over the years is we're approving non-farm dwellings without really considering carrying capacity. It's whether it's ag land or forest land, and that's about it. What if the area is in a groundwater management area and you put non-farm dwellings in there? That's another well that's exempt from going through the process. Should we be approving non-farm dwellings in groundwater management areas? Should we be approving non-farm or non-forest dwellings in wildfire hazard areas? Are we looking really at the carrying capacity of the subject land for these types of developments? Because water is a great example. For every straw that goes down into the ground, that's impacting agricultural water rights because they don't have to prove up their exempt wells. And cumulatively, they can have as much impact on agriculture as another huge person putting a well out there. And the interesting thing about that is, what does the Water Resources Department say when the farmer complains about a bunch of non-farm dwellings and rural residential dwellings? They just tell the farmer to drill the well deeper. You know, so the farmer's being impacted by that non-farm development because of water rights, so to speak. And then lastly, we really need to, and this gets to what Jennifer was talking about, we really need to get criteria to bring to focus how to do the cumulative impacts analysis. And I've done a lot of cumulative impacts analyses over my career, generally related more with plan amendments and zone changes and urban growth boundary expansions and the like. And to be quite honest, I reinvent it every time I do one. And it's just, but it's easier for me to say that because I've done so many of them and it's just the way I do things. but we really do need to get some more direction for people that don't do these types of things on a routine basis like I do, so.
So on that particular point, so do you think it's more beneficial for this type of analysis to be done on a case by case basis or as a planning exercise?
Well, the best, as a planning exercise, it'd be great. That is a lot of work, and that's, you know, I think you've got to, as we get to it, I'm gonna go right back to Tamara's situation in Morrow and Umatilla counties with the guama out there. We could do that on a planning basis there. We know we've got carrying capacity issues. We know there's a cumulative impact issue there. It may be both. It may be both targeted areas versus others. I don't know, but there are areas where we know the cumulative impact has been reached. Let's apply that on the ground. There's other areas that's less obvious, and there's less of a need for that because, like Jennifer's saying, they've had 2 non-farm dwellings or something in years and years and years. So you know.
Blair and then Tamara.
Yeah, I sort of think that Jim's ideas, I think, are all really, really good. And I think where we can find what's interesting too about the mapping that he talked about, the groundwater, the critical groundwater areas, the high risk wildfire areas, and ODFW has also done extensive mapping, and you know, a policy working group could figure out what the appropriate ones, but they have the essential, limited, important, irreplaceable wildlife. That didn't exist before, and because we've sort of abandoned periodic review, it's not in all the county plans, probably not in most county plans. But if it's just like, we don't need more non-farm development, that because these are carrying capacity issues, it would be simple. I mean, simple is kind of a big word, but you know, easier to just have it mapped. Like, this is not where we're going to have more non-farm development. So I think it could be very effective if we can figure out a way that's acceptable as a policy basis. I also want to say, you know, you asked me to talk about Rutherford, but we kind of skipped over an issue that the folks in Central and Eastern Oregon asked me to talk about, which is in the case by case approval of non-farm dwellings in terms of determining whether land is generally unsuitable for the production of crops or livestock. They're having the same issues that we're seeing with larger redesignations of ag land, and that soil scientists are being hired to say this land is worthless, you know, this piece of land is worthless, and then you cut off a piece. So I think we need to get into, and later, how do you properly use a soil scientist or not? You know, does the NRSCS soil survey stay? Is that kind of the final word? And then one more element, which is before 1994, you had to consider whether the entire parcel was unsuitable for farm use, because the policy was, we don't want to just divide it all up and cut it. And I think Jim's recommendation of limiting the division part of it goes a long, long way. But really the question is, the entire parcel unsuitable for protection is a much better question than a portion, because there's always going to be a portion, as he pointed out. Maybe not in Clackamas County, but once you get outside the really productive areas of high value farmland throughout the state or the Willamette Valley, you're going to find a portion of a farm that has unsuitable land. And do we really want to put, considering now the density and the pressure on ag lands, to keep putting more non-farm dwellings on portions for that reason?
Thank you, Blair. All right, Tamara and then Maitri.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful, Blair. Jim, I wanted to respond because you asked. I think an additional standard, I would be supportive of that to address the carrying capacity issue, because right now we don't, and I don't think in any of our lifetimes we'll ever address the exempt well conundrum. And for folks who don't understand that exempt well, OWRD does not require a water right if an exempt well, for an exempt well. So anytime you build a house, you do not need a water right for the dwelling. You can, it allows you to use 15,000 gallons per day, which is quite a bit of water, and irrigate up to a half an acre. So I think addressing water quantity as well as water quantity, because we're also in a groundwater management area with some significant water quality issues, and there are a couple of other of those in the state as well. So for the record, responding to Jim, adding another standard. And I also just want to say thanks, Jim, for being honest, because I too think every time I do the cumulative impacts analysis, it changes, you know? And I think some sort of template or a standard would be helpful to follow that. I'm not, I don't think myself, I'm sure our elected officials in this part of the state would not support removing the land division standards. But if you wanted to add some sidebars, that would be helpful. And part of the reason is some of those non-farm dwellings that we've permitted make a huge positive impact in some of our very rural areas. Like Ione has a population, 300, in Lexington, it's even smaller than that. And some of those outlier areas where it's not even rangeland, it's a really useful tool because it adds to the value overall of the community. I'm not suggesting we're promoting those as a tool for small rural areas, but it does add a value. So if we don't hear that voice in this discussion, you'll hear it either in the formal rulemaking process or through the legislature. It's been very popular since since House Bill 3661.
All right, so thank you, Tamara. So hearing another vote also for standards related to carrying capacity being added. Matri?
So I just wanted to follow up on the non-farm dwellings. We haven't seen too many applications in the last few years, and some of them actually have been for properties where the non-farm dwelling approval had expired and they came back on that. But for the most part, what I see is they're generally in the vicinity of other properties that have a non-farm dwelling, and that people usually have a soil scientist, and that's part of what made me remember. People usually have a soil scientist report accompanying it. They also have a farmer's report attached to it saying why an experienced farmer who's been in the area farming for decades as to why the property is unsuitable for farming, or if they were to convert the property into a more farmable one, whether the economic burden would be practical or not. So those are some of the factors that applicants typically address. We require them to address in their application. And yeah, like I said, we haven't really seen too many, and none of them have been in kind of an isolated patch where there's a new dwelling being approved in a completely area of vacant parcels or generally farm dwelling. It's usually in a cluster that I've seen where people are not farming the properties, or the property doesn't lend itself to farming. But it's been like, 3 or 4 years we haven't seen any applications in.
Thank you, Matri. That's interesting. So Washington County, Matri is from Washington County. I'm not seeing so many non-farm dwelling applications, and where they are, they're sort of clustered in areas, is what I'm hearing you say there. All right, this has been a super interesting conversation. I kind of wish we could spend the last half hour that we have continuing this, but I want to touch on a couple more things. So I want to talk about template test alignments, rectangles for template tests for about 5 minutes, and then talk about income standards. So when you do a template test, I'm just going to assume most people know for a template test, you center either a square or rectangle on the center of a tract, and then look at pattern of development sort of within that template. And there were recent changes which are now almost effective throughout the entire state. On November 1st, House Bill 2225 will be fully implemented, which really tightens up the template test standards for the square. So there have been a couple of questions about alignments of the rectangle template test. So if you are on a road that existed as of a certain date, and if you have a certain size parcel, then you can align your rectangular template test along the road or the stream, if you fall into that second category. And there's been some question I get a couple times a year actually, about how to align a rectangular template test appropriately, because those features aren't always linear. I know Clatsop County spent a great deal of time looking into GIS methodologies to do that. I understand Yamhill County has a methodology that's fairly straightforward and simple, where they require 2 corners of the rectangle to be equidistant from the center of the road. That's it. So there's still some wiggle room. I would imagine with that rectangle. Lori, do you know how Lane does it for rectangles?
There's no standards at all. And so what happens is you just have a small portion of the parcel that's aligned with, let's just say, the road, because you don't have to have any sized acreage to use just the road rectangle. And then it drops away, and they can use the drop away portion, even though there's no alignment with the road whatsoever. The road drops away, the parcel's no longer contiguous with the road, no longer parallel with the road. I think there should be some kind of standard where it's at least 50% of the length is aligned, so that the reason in Lane County they choose the rectangle, which they don't choose as often as the square, is because that's the only way they're going to qualify the template dwelling. So because there aren't any additional standards about how to deal with as much as practicably possible, they just allow almost anything. I also don't understand why there's a distinction between the provision for the rectangle on the road being aligned with the road, and then the other one, road or perennial stream, 60 acres or larger. Somebody must have had, there must have been a person who lobbied for that, because we rarely see anyone trying to align with the stream, but a stream is easier to align with in our experience than a road. And finally, the last thing would be, there needs to be language that this is a public road, not an access easement road, not a local access road that aren't considered public roads by ORS 368, because this is a big problem here in Lane County, using anything as a road.
Thank you, Lori. And I've heard questions from other planners too, what qualifies as a road. In the lot of record dwelling provisions, there's a reference to definition and statute of public road, but there's not the same for the template test provisions. Jennifer, Clackamas does a lot of template reviews. Do you have this issue with the rectangle?
Well, it's interesting because I'm listening to this thinking, how come the planners aren't coming to me with these questions? So I guess I would say they must have figured it out, but I don't actually know what they're doing. I just popped open the standard just to look. So, and of course, occasionally our code, while we try to follow the state, I'll look at it and they'll be like, there's a few words here that don't quite match. So I'm just looking at our version. But it does still say that they have to use the mathematical centroid. Is that consistent with the state? Okay. And then, we haven't tried to flesh that out, of course, in our code, what it means. I am curious looking at it. It does say it abuts a road. And I think we've had this question before about what if the road just dead ends into the property, because that happens and it abuts it for 20 feet. Was that really the intent? Probably not. So I guess I don't know what we're doing, but I do know that this isn't great. We should have something that's a little more specific.
A little bit more clear there. Okay. And then Matri, I think this was actually your question, wasn't it?
Yes, we run into that all the time.
Yeah.
There's just a little bit in a corner that's abutting the road and they try to line it with that. Or there's some kind of in the aerials it's showing, but that's not really a proper road. So how do we address that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would be great to have really clarified like in the law of record standards.
I agree. So I wanted to raise the issue here, and in this conversation, we're running out of time, so hopefully we can have some back and forth a little bit more on this, sort of ideas to resolve this, in the exchange between the next meeting. So I did also want to touch on, income standards, which a lot of people brought up, in comments. So there are also questions about the practically managed standard and a couple of other things. I mentioned the Measure 49 issue earlier. So there are two questions that are coming up related to the income standard. One is, how do you verify income for a primary farm dwelling? And then the other one, as a planner, like what documentation do you accept? I'm curious for counties, like what do you require in an application for a primary farm dwelling? What materials do you review?
Well, in Lane County, again, we're not really a farm county, but for a primary farm dwelling, they have to show basically just those Schedule Fs. And they're not, as your notes show, Hillary, they're not very specific. They can also just come up with random receipts, sold cattle here and there at auction. That's used a lot. These auction receipts, it's like somebody tore off a little page in a little receipt booklet. That's all it is, has a date. Might say one steer, just very little information. And then just somebody scribbles down a dollar amount. And that together with Schedule Fs, that's it.
Maitri, what do you do in Washington?
We insist applicants provide the Schedule Fs where they can, and it varies from one property to the other. I mean, sometimes it's a cumulative farm where they have 5 or 6 properties, but that are separately located, and their Schedule F includes all of that. So we try to get a proportionality where the acreage kind of corresponds with the income, a little bit of calculation there, and also people sometimes do provide invoices. But a lot of the times the properties really, it's just a tract maybe at the most, and they're providing the income standards, and it more or less seems reasonable for the size of the property and the type of farming they have. That income looks reasonable for that, so we do go by that.
Great, thank you. And Jennifer, what do you do for verification?
So it's similar, and honestly, it's a struggle. I mean, we do the best we can, but yes, Schedule F, yes, receipts. We try to, at least look at an aerial picture and see if it looks like they're farming berries on that property. If they're giving us, receipts for berries, we look at, I can't remember, Jim, is it the ODA that publishes this like agriculture book that tells us like what the yield ought to be off a certain number of, anyway, we'll pull that up, figure out what the crop is, kind of think does this seem realistic that they're harvesting this many berries off this size property? But I know, the planners who do these, they struggle. It's hard to feel like you have really good evidence, and we're not saying people are trying to like lie about it, but we just have a very hard time verifying. And one thing that we're finding, I've helped planners with a couple in, say over the last year or two, where we've got, let's call it the quote unquote same farmer who might own multiple tracts or parcels of land in the county. They're potentially contiguous, not contiguous. They're in different LLCs. Sometimes the farm operator is one LLC, the owner of the land is a different LLC. It's potentially really the same person. You're trying to unwind all this and figure, well, so do they already have a dwelling? Do they not have a dwelling? Because technically it's a different owner. If it's a different LLC, are the rules intended to work that way? There's some, for really good reasons. I'm sure the farmers in the room can tell me there are really good reasons for this, but it's pretty sophisticated in terms of how the land is owned and who's filing the taxes, and how all those entities relate. It's the struggle to kind of navigate the code, the rules and apply it to real world situations. So yeah, some technical help on all of that to make these easier to process would be great.
Does anybody require CPA affidavits or as well? No. So we have two people in the room here who are actually on the original technical working group when income standards were established. And I was wondering if Mike and Jim might have some insight into what was originally intended.
Well, and I've got some
Yeah.
questions I want to ask for the group to be thinking about, but the original intent was basically to try to put an objective standard to the case law. We were dealing with case law that, you know, there were probably 8 or 9 different court cases that you would have to apply to determine whether something was a farm dwelling or not. And we were trying to, you know, quantify that a little bit more. We partially succeeded, but I don't think it's a perfect test. And it leads me to some questions, some bigger questions. And the first one is there really a need for more farm dwellings? There were 40,000 plus farms in Oregon in 2002. In 2017 census, there's 37,600 farms. There's less farms than there were. Do we, you know, why are we approving more farm dwellings? That's the first question I have. Second, the income standard, the $80,000 test. That test was established back in the 90s. You know, when you look at census data for what a farm makes, the average farm in 2017 in Oregon made $135,000, the average farm. And that was with government payments. Without government payments, it's $133,000. So the 80,000 test is for high value farmland is way below that. If you look at the state, 72% of the land area that's in farm use, so that's in farm use, not necessarily just farms, generates more than $100,000 per farm. So the question I have is do the numbers need to be updated? I mean, they used to be updated for inflation, and LCDC removed that years back. I'm not sure that was the right decision, but that happened. But even if you don't adjust for inflation every year, it may be time to adjust because it's been so long, those tests. I know that some people would argue, well, the $80,000 test will weed out, you know, the true non-farmers. I'm not so sure it does anymore. $80,000 is a gross income, and that's probably around 12,000 net income, something like that. So that's my first question. The second is the capability test. And Jennifer, you referred to the numbers where you can look at yields and the like. Those numbers aren't available anymore. OSU used to do those numbers, and they haven't done those now for 10 to 20 years. So the ability to do that capability test really doesn't exist anymore. And so the question I have is, do we even continue to have that as a standard in the farm dwelling test? It's just the data's not there to do it. And so, in fact, I would argue because the data is not there to do it, you can't apply it, but it's still being applied. And let's see here. What was my other one? Well, I think that's enough. I probably blew the lid off here asking the question about, but you know, the original committee, you know, Mike might have something to add to that or whatever. We were really trying to put an objective standard to about 5 or 6 different court cases that were making it really difficult for counties to determine when a farm dwelling was, you know, whether it was MATIO or whatever case, you know, so that's my recollection. Mike?
Right, the whole intent of it was to show that the person on the land or that owned that was principally engaged in farming. And so how do you determine if somebody's principally engaged? Well, they have to make a significant amount of income. And what was that number? Well, we came up with that number in 1994. And we figured at that time that if you were a farmer that was lucky, 25% of the 80,000 might be profit, which is $20,000. And at that time, you could sort of survive as a farmer on $20,000. But the intent was that you were making enough income that your profits from that would allow you to live. And that was your principal income. That was the whole intent. And today, we have very thin margins in Oregon. We have very high labor costs. And you're lucky, in some cases, we make 10% of our gross income as profit on a very good year. Maybe we have one this year, we might make 20%, but 10% of 80,000 now is an $8,000 income for a farmer, and I don't think you're really farming. at that point, and I think it should clearly be 250,000 by now. But there's a couple of, the other issue you brought up is how you document it. This is a very serious problem that we need to address and simplify, and it also goes to a bunch of other tests like the 25% test for farm stands, et cetera. We really have to detail what we need. And I think the state needs to say, and for this, I think you need more than a Schedule F. You actually need the receipts, well-documented receipts from every sale you make that brings that up to that level, the actual receipt from the processor, the packing house, the auction yard, or whatever. And we need to specify in code exactly what that's going to be. Otherwise, it's too complicated and not consistently applied. The other thing I wanted to mention about this test and the non-farm dwelling test is because we're not clear, because it's complicated, because it's wide open. A lot of these things are really a wealth test. And they are a test of who can hire the best land use consultant and the best attorney and the best soil scientist. And I'm an old white male, but I totally believe in equity and fairness. And we had one example where a Hispanic worker we know bought a piece of property and the realtor told him it was potentially buildable. Well, it turned out he didn't have enough information. It was not buildable. He found that out after he bought a lot he was going to build on. And somebody else probably could buy it, spend $50,000 on an attorney and make it a buildable lot. So I think we have to be really simple and really clear. So it's really fair. And it's not about who can hire the best attorney.
One thing about the Schedule F too, there's nothing, when you require a Schedule F, I don't know how the counties are determining whether that was the one that was actually filed with the IRS or not. All you got to do is get the form online, fill it out and send it into the county. It's not like it's been stamped that it went to the IRS and that's what they approved or anything like that. It's just, here's the form and it's filled out. We don't know if that was actually what happened. So the Schedule F sounds good in theory, but because it's not certified, so to speak, or anything like that by some third party, that's, we don't know if that's the true situation.
Have you guys thought about the CPA affidavits?
We've actually tried that in several situations relative to the 25% test. And one CPA said, we will not provide that information for our client. And so, and that may be a unique situation where that CPA wouldn't do it. But one reason is the CPA is reluctant to provide information counter to their client. And in this particular case, it clearly would have been counter to their client because we had other information. But I don't think that's a good method. Unfortunately, I think planners have to see the raw data, whatever that is. Otherwise, you don't know anything.
Yeah, some are very easy. Jennifer mentioned this too. If you've got a tract in North Clackamas County that's 80 acres and 2/3 of it's in nursery stock, we know it's a commercial farm. But if it's 2 acres and they're saying they're making 80,000 in nursery stock, I don't care what forms they provide me. I'm going to question that as somebody that knows agriculture. So,
Blair.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I know Marion County staff has been dealing with this a lot, and they've run into the problem of documentation of the 80,000, and they're looking at the documentation and they know it's not quite right, but they really don't have any way to kind of, we just need to help that process. I mean, they're realizing it's a non-arm's length transaction, things, Schedule Fs that you just pick up the post office and are never certified and never filed or being used, but they don't really have the ammunition or tools to kind of say, we don't buy this, right? So it's tough. So we need to help them get that clarified. And they do the same thing that Jennifer mentioned. They go out and do they get aerial photographs and they do site, but it seemed like such a great idea at the time, the $80,000 test, and kind of foolproof. And it's just strange that the documentation is a little tougher than I think we ever anticipated.
Yeah. So we are running out of time. So this is clearly, I heard very clearly that there's an issue in compiling and getting adequate substantial evidence for these tests. And I think there needs to be like sort of more thinking done on, what that looks like. What would make life easier for counties so they don't have to be experts in accounting and devote, hours and hours and hours of staff time, like for non-farm dwelling to be used to this sort of thing. So I think let's do some more thinking and follow up between the meetings. So after this meeting, I'm going to review the recording, and tomorrow I will send out a revised meeting 3 matrix, recapping the feedback that I've heard from these conversations. It went really quickly. I can't believe 2 hours went by so fast.
I can't believe you're gonna have this done by tomorrow. Wow.
Well, while it's fresh in my mind, I'd like to listen to it and get it
Good
down
for you.
and give you guys plenty of time to get responses back. So if I have not captured everything from this conversation, let me know. If you have additional thoughts on any of these topics as you go home and like are pondering what we touched on today, go ahead and provide comments. So I'll get that out tomorrow so you can look at it, think about it, and provide any additional feedback on that recap. Our next meeting is going to be October 25th. It is an hour-and-a-half long meeting, and we are going to be talking about soils challenges. We're going to be talking about the definition of agricultural lands, the definition of high-value farmland, and our authority to limit uses on high-value farmland. We're going to be talking about forest lands and non-resource lands. So that's the October 25th meeting, and I will get the matrix for that out a week before that meeting. We got I did get a lot of feedback on those topics originally. If you have additional feedback on those topics that sort of evolved over these conversations, go ahead and feel free to send that out before the 18th, so I can get it into that matrix for the meeting on the 25th. Our last meeting is scheduled for November 2nd. And on November 2nd, we'll be going over macro level mapping, data and analysis, right? We'll have a discussion, another one about cumulative impacts. We are going to be talking about the program intersection with Goal 5, particularly habitat. We are going to be talking about use standards for mixed farm forest zones, religious land use and institutionalized persons act, transportation uses, and a couple other uses like landfills, fill permits. And I've got an update on energy storage for folks. If we need another meeting after that, we do have one tentatively scheduled for November 29th. Yes. 29th. So we'll see if we need that. I am writing the summary report as we are going through this now. So I've been working on the section on multi-path permitting and non-farm uses. So if you have additional comments or thoughts from that second meeting, go ahead and forward these to me. And my intention is to be able to get a draft of that report to you guys fairly soon after we have our last meeting. Right. So that was a very fast Monday morning. So thank you all again very much for devoting your time to this effort. These conversations are so interesting. I think I'm learning so much from them, and I appreciate your engagement. So we'll see you on the 25th.
Blair, when are you bringing me back from Italy?
Where Blair will
We're on the
have-
spot.
I'm gonna bring back some olive trees from Mike to grow.
Nice.
Good. That's cool.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all. We'll see you in a bit.
Thank you.